I stood at my own sister Jada's wedding rehearsal, extending my hand in greeting to her new father-in-law. Instead of shaking it, the man looked right through me, draped his damp, heavy overcoat across my arm, and ordered me to fetch him champagne. He assumed I was the hired help. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed his coat to the woman who secretly owned his entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through a room full of people who completely underestimated your worth, and if you know the power of moving in absolute silence. My name is Simone. I am 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has been obsessed with the illusion of status. Tonight, that obsession had culminated in the grand ballroom of the Oakbridge Country Club. The room smelled of aged bourbon, roasted duck, and the desperate need to impress. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a golden glow over the tables draped in imported silk linens. A smooth jazz quartet played softly in the corner, providing the soundtrack for a room full of people who possessed more arrogance than actual capital. I stood near the entrance, taking in the scene. I wore a tailored emerald green crepe dress, not flashy, no visible logos, just quiet, understated quality. I had spent the last decade building Vanguard Acquisitions, a private equity firm, from the ground up, turning myself into a very wealthy woman. But to my family, I was just Simone, the stubborn older sister, who refused to play their social climbing games. My sister Jada had always chased this exact aesthetic. She wanted the country club membership, the old money surname, and the whispered approval of people who would never truly accept her. She thought she found all of that in Preston Sterling. The Sterlings were a family whose name was plastered on half the decaying real estate in the city. They carried themselves with the unbearable weight of historical privilege. From the moment Jada and Preston started dating, my mother treated the Sterlings like royalty, treating every interaction with them as an audition for a life she felt she deserved. My mother Brenda had spent the entire morning demanding I behave perfectly. She hovered over me while I got dressed, warning me not to look too intimidating and not to talk about my business, because the Sterlings preferred traditional women. She wanted me to shrink so Jada could shine in the reflection of Richard Sterling's supposed wealth. I kept my distance because my line of work taught me how to read financial statements, and the Sterlings always projected a lifestyle that their actual balance sheets could not support. But tonight was about my sister, so I swallowed my reservations and decided to be the supportive older sibling. I took a deep breath and made my way across the thick Persian carpet toward the center of the room. Richard Sterling, Preston's father, was holding court near the private bar. He was a tall, imposing white man in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly back and a face flushed from too much scotch and too little accountability. He was wearing a custom tuxedo, holding a crystal tumbler in one hand and gesturing wildly with the other as he entertained a group of equally pretentious men. I waited patiently for a break in his laughter before stepping forward. I put on my best polite smile, the one I reserve for difficult board meetings, and extended my right hand. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice clear and steady over the murmur of the room. "I am Simone Jada's older sister. It is a pleasure to finally formally meet you." Richard stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head slowly, blinking down at me, as if a stray dog had just wandered into his private dining room. His pale blue eyes scanned my face, then dropped to my extended hand, and finally dragged up and down my emerald dress. He did not see a successful 35-year-old woman. He did not see his future daughter-in-law's sister. In that brief, agonizing second of calculation, he saw a black woman standing in a hyper-exclusive country club, and his deeply ingrained prejudice made the only assumption his narrow mind could comprehend. He let out a short, dismissive breath. Without breaking eye contact, he shifted his weight, unbuttoned the heavy, damp cashmere overcoat he had been draping over his shoulder, and tossed it directly onto my outstretched arm. The sheer weight of the wool forced my arm down slightly. The coat was damp from the light rain outside and smelled strongly of stale cigar smoke and cheap mints. I stood there frozen in sheer disbelief. Before my brain could even fully process the audacity of the gesture, Richard turned his body slightly away from me, waving his empty glass in the air. Be a dear and find the coat check, would you? He barked, his tone dripping with condescension. And tell the kitchen we need more champagne out here. The service tonight is absolutely slipping. He immediately turned back to his friends, resuming his story as if I had already vanished into the wallpaper. The men around him chuckled, casting brief, indifferent glances my way. The jazz music continued to play. The clinking of glasses echoed across the room. Everything around me kept moving, but I was entirely still. The damp cashmere felt like a physical manifestation of every racist microaggression, every condescending remark, and every silent dismissal I had ever endured in my life. A younger version of myself might have crumbled. A different woman might have raised her voice, caused a scene, and given them the exact stereotype they expected to see. But I am not that woman. I am a woman who acquires broken companies for a living and strips them down to their copper wires. My mind instantly shifted from sister of the bride to chief executive officer. I recognized the pathology of a man like Richard. His arrogance was a shield for his incompetence. Men who treat people like garbage in public are almost always hiding massive failures in private. They demand subservience because their actual authority is slipping through their fingers. I knew this because my firm specialized in buying out the massive debts of failing developers exactly like him. I looked at the heavy coat resting on my arm. The disrespect was so casual, so effortlessly cruel that it was almost breathtaking. He had not merely ignored my introduction, he had actively erased my identity to put me in what he believed was my rightful place. I slowly lowered my arm, letting the incredibly expensive cashmere slide off my skin and fall directly onto the floor. It landed with a soft thud against the polished hardwood right next to his polished leather shoes. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. The urge to scream was replaced by a deep, glacial calm. I did not need to shout to destroy Richard Sterling. I just needed to let him keep digging his own grave. The soft thud of the heavy cashmere coat hitting the floor was barely audible over the jazz band, but to my mother, Brenda, it might as well have been a gunshot echoing through the ballroom. Before I could even take a full breath to center myself, I felt sharp acrylic fingernails dig painfully into my bare forearm. I was suddenly yanked backward with a force that nearly made me lose my footing in my heels. It was my mother. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with a frantic, terrified energy. She did not look at my face to see if I was okay. She did not ask why the father of the groom had just treated her eldest daughter like the hired help. Instead, she dropped to her knees on the polished hardwood floor in her expensive silk gown, scrambling to retrieve Richard Sterling's discarded coat. She scooped it up as if it were a fragile newborn baby brushing imaginary dust off the dark fabric with trembling hands. When she finally stood back up, her grip returned to my arm, this time pulling me forcefully into the shadowed alcove near the restrooms, away from the prying eyes of the Sterling family guests. "What is exactly wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that barely contained her rising panic. "Are you out of your mind, Simone? You just dropped his coat on the floor for everyone to see. You are always doing this, always trying to ruin everything for your sister, always trying to embarrass this family." I looked down at her hand wrapped tightly around my arm. Her knuckles were white. For 35 years, this had been our exact dynamic. I was the designated shock absorber for every ounce of anxiety and insecurity my mother possessed. Whenever the world made her feel small, she made sure to make me feel smaller. "Mom, let go of my arm," I said evenly. My voice did not rise. It did not shake. She squeezed tighter, leaning in so close I could smell the sharp peppermint of her breath, mixed with the panic sweat beneath her expensive perfume. "You need to swallow your foolish pride for one night," she demanded, her eyes darting nervously toward the ballroom to make sure Richard had not noticed the commotion. "You do not understand how things work in the real world, Simone. The Sterlings are real money. They are legacy. They open doors that people like us are not even allowed to knock on. If Richard Sterling hands you his coat, you smile, you say thank you, and you go hang it up. You do not stand there trying to make some kind of petty point." Jada has finally secured a future for herself, and I will not let your bitter jealousy destroy her big moment. Her words hit exactly the way she intended them to. They were meticulously designed to cut deep to remind me of my designated place in our family hierarchy. Jada was the golden child, the beautiful daughter who understood the assignment of marrying well and conforming to my mother's obsession with aesthetics. I was the independent problem child who worked too hard, spoke too directly, and refused to bend the knee to the altar of fake prestige. My mother was looking at me with such raw desperation that for a fraction of a second I almost pitied her. She had spent her entire adult life chasing the validation of wealthy white society. She bought into the lie that proximity to their power made her powerful. She was entirely willing to sacrifice my basic human dignity just to ensure she could keep taking pictures in their exclusive country club and posting them online for her friends to envy. She did not know that the legacy she was worshipping was currently rotting from the inside out. She did not know that the real money in the room did not belong to the man drinking scotch by the bar, but to the daughter she was currently digging her nails into. I have never been jealous of Jada a single day in my life, Mom, I replied, keeping my tone terrifyingly flat. And if you think real money behaves the way that man just did, then you are even more lost than I thought. Do not you dare lecture me, she spat back, her eyes narrowing into angry slits. I scraped and sacrificed to get you girls into good neighborhoods so you would not have to struggle. Jada listened to me. She is marrying into a family that owns half this state. And look at you, still single, still pretending your little consulting business makes you better than everyone else. I am warning you, Simone. You are going to walk back out there, you are going to apologize to Richard for the misunderstanding, and you are going to put this coat away. Or you can leave right now and not bother coming to the wedding tomorrow. It was the ultimate threat, the threat of exile. For years, that exact threat had kept me in line. The fear of being entirely cut off from the only family I had ever known usually forced me into submission. I would bite my tongue, pay the bills she demanded, and shrink myself to keep the peace. But standing in that dimly lit alcove, staring at the woman who birthed me, I realized something profoundly liberating. I did not need them anymore. I had not needed them in a very long time. The emotional hold she thought she had over me was just a ghost, a lingering habit from a childhood I had already survived. I looked at her hand on my arm one last time. Slowly and deliberately, I reached over and peeled her fingers off my skin one by one. She gasped softly, shocked by the quiet, absolute authority in my movement. I will not be apologizing to Richard, I said, my eyes locking onto hers with a chilling clarity. I will not be touching his coat ever again, and I will absolutely be attending the wedding tomorrow. You should go make sure Jada is enjoying her rehearsal dinner, Mom. The Sterlings are going to need all the support they can get very soon. Before she could stutter out another reprimand, I turned my back on her. I walked away, leaving her standing alone in the shadows, clutching a damp coat that belonged to a bankrupt man. My heart beat in a steady, triumphant rhythm as I stepped back into the glowing light of the ballroom. I walked directly toward the private bar at the far end of the room, my mind already shifting gears. The emotional games were over. It was time to execute my plan. I made my way to the private mahogany bar tucked into the far corner of the ballroom. The bartender, a young man in a crisp white shirt, asked what I wanted. I ordered a sparkling water with a twist of lime. I needed my mind perfectly clear for what was about to happen. As he handed me the heavy crystal glass, I turned to face the room. The smooth jazz band was playing a soft rendition of a classic tune, and the warm lighting made everything look like a scene from an old movie. But I was not swept up in the romance of it all. I was scanning the room like a predator mapping its territory. I reached into my small clutch and pulled out my phone. It was a secure device strictly for my corporate operations. I bypassed the usual family group chats, filled with my mother's frantic updates and Jada's wedding countdowns. I opened my direct line to my executive team at Vanguard Acquisitions. My team was used to my late-night requests. We operated on the pulse of the global market, and distressed assets did not sleep. I stood there bathed in the soft ambient light of the country club and quickly typed out a single message. Pull the complete financial dossier on Sterling Development Group. I want every outstanding loan, every leveraged asset, and every hidden liability. I want it on my desk by midnight. I hit send. There was no hesitation. There was no lingering doubt. I slipped the phone back into my bag and took a slow sip of my cold water. My eyes tracked across the room, locking back onto Richard Sterling. He was standing exactly where I had left him, minus his damp overcoat. He had drawn an even larger crowd of sycophants now. He was holding his crystal glass of scotch high, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. He looked so incredibly secure in his position at the top of the social hierarchy. He truly believed he was the most powerful person in the room. He believed his whiteness, his gender, and his family name made him entirely untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet black woman he had just tried to humiliate was currently running the numbers on his entire existence. Vanguard Acquisitions was not just a regular private equity firm. I had built it from the ground up to specialize in corporate autopsies. We found companies that were bleeding out, companies that looked perfectly healthy on the outside, but were suffocating under mountains of bad debt on the inside. We bought their debt for pennies on the dollar, and then we held all the cards. I knew a man like Richard Sterling was a prime target. Men like him spent so much time and money polishing their public image that they completely neglected their actual financial foundations. They borrowed against their own hubris until the banks finally stopped returning their phone calls. My gaze drifted over to my sister Jada and her fiancé Preston. They were posing for the wedding photographer near a massive floral arrangement of white orchids. Jada looked beautiful, her smile perfectly rehearsed. Preston had his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, leaning in to whisper something that made her giggle. He had the exact same arrogant posture as his father. He wore his inherited wealth like a protective shield. Jada thought she had won the lottery. She thought she was marrying into a powerful dynasty that would secure her place in high society forever. She did not realize she was eagerly chaining herself to a rapidly sinking ship. Then I spotted my mother Brenda near the dessert table. She was aggressively networking, handing out her fake bright smiles to anyone who would make eye contact with her. She was trying so desperately hard to belong to a world that would never actually claim her. She had willingly sacrificed my feelings, my dignity, and our entire relationship just for a temporary guest pass to this exclusive country club. It was pathetic and tragic, but standing there watching her, I realized I could no longer allow her sickness to infect my peace. The invisible chains of family obligation that had held me down for 35 years simply snapped. The contrast between the loud noise of the party and the total silence of my execution was intoxicating. They were all playing an elaborate game of pretend. They were dancing on a floor that was rotting right underneath their expensive leather shoes. And the absolute best part was that I did not have to raise my voice to stop the music. I did not have to throw a drink or scream or make a scene to demand their respect. True power does not need an audience to validate it. True power moves in the dark. It is calculated and cold, and it strikes when you least expect it. My phone vibrated softly inside my clutch. It was a reply from my lead analyst. Received. Compiling the data now. The jazz music swelled as the band transitioned into a much faster tempo. The room buzzed with careless laughter and the constant clinking of expensive crystal. I stood in the corner alone but completely in control. I smiled a cold, knowing smile. Drink up, Richard, I thought to myself, watching him take another generous gulp of his aged scotch. Enjoy your expensive champagne and your elite country club membership tonight. Because tomorrow, the bill comes due, and you have absolutely no idea who is collecting. The morning of the wedding arrived with a pale gray light that felt entirely appropriate for the disaster I knew was coming. I was sitting in the corner of the massive bridal suite at the Oakbridge Country Club, holding a cup of black coffee and watching the chaos unfold. The room was supposed to be a sanctuary of joy and celebration. Instead, it looked like a war zone covered in white tulle and spilled champagne. 3 makeup artists were frozen in the corner holding their brushes like weapons, unsure if they should continue blending Jada's foundation or run for the door. The source of the chaos was standing in the center of the room. It was the head coordinator for the elite catering company, a tall, stern man named Julian, who looked like he had survived 1,000 bridezilla meltdowns and was completely immune to this one. He was holding a sleek silver tablet, tapping the screen with a manicured finger. His voice was devastatingly calm, which only made my sister Jada scream louder. "I am telling you, Julian, this is a banking error," Jada shrieked, pacing across the thick carpet in her custom silk bridal robe. Her hair was half pinned up, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, manic energy. "You are making a massive mistake. Preston comes from one of the wealthiest families in the state. They do not bounce checks. You need to call your bank right now and tell them to process the wire." Julian did not blink. "Mom, I have spoken to our bank 3 times this morning," he replied, his tone flat and professional. The wire transfer for the final $45,000 payment was initiated yesterday afternoon by Richard Sterling. However, it was rejected by the issuing institution for insufficient funds. This is not a processing error on our end. The account is frozen or empty. Per our contract, we do not set up the raw seafood bar, the carving stations, or the champagne tower until the final balance is cleared. My staff is currently loading the equipment back into the trucks. Jada let out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a growl. She snatched her phone off the velvet vanity stool and aggressively dialed Preston's number for what must have been the 10th time in 5 minutes. It went straight to voicemail again. She threw the phone onto the plush sofa and turned to our mother Brenda, who was pacing just as frantically near the window. "Mom, do something!" Jada demanded, tears of absolute panic welling up in her eyes. "The guests are going to be arriving for the cocktail hour in 4 hours. If there is no food, I will be the laughingstock of the entire city. Preston's friends are flying in from New York and London. We cannot serve them nothing. Call Richard. Call someone. Fix this." My mother looked like she was going to hyperventilate. The meticulously crafted illusion she had built her entire social identity around was cracking right in front of her face. She picked up her own phone, her hands shaking violently as she scrolled through her contacts. "I am calling Richard right now," Brenda muttered, her voice tight with forced optimism. "It is just a misunderstanding, Jada baby. Do not ruin your makeup. You know how these big bank transfers are. Sometimes they flag large amounts for fraud protection. The sterlings are real money. Real money does not bounce." I took a slow sip of my coffee, the dark roast tasting particularly sweet this morning. I knew exactly why the wire had bounced. It was not a fraud alert, and it was certainly not a clerical error. The dossier my team at Vanguard Acquisitions had pulled at midnight painted a picture of absolute financial devastation. Richard Sterling had been running a high-end Ponzi scheme using new investor capital to pay off old loans while heavily leveraging his own personal assets to maintain his country club lifestyle. He was millions of dollars in debt, and yesterday evening, my firm had acquired a controlling interest in that debt. Early this morning, my legal team had filed the emergency injunctions to freeze his accounts. The Sterling empire was dead, and the catering bill was just the first casualty. But I did not say a word. I just sat in the corner chair, crossing my legs and watching the delusion play out in real time. It was fascinating to see how hard my mother and sister fought to protect a lie they desperately wanted to be true. Julian cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence in the room. "Ladies, I sympathize with your situation, but I have a business to run. If I do not have a confirmed payment of $45,000 in the next 15 minutes, I am pulling my entire staff off the property. We have other events this weekend, and I cannot pay my team with promises of legacy wealth." "Wait!" Jada screamed, lunging forward and grabbing Julian's arm. "You cannot leave. You just cannot. I will have Preston write you a personal check the second he gets here. I promise you, Julian. Just start setting up the tables. Please." Julian gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. "We do not accept personal checks on the day of the event," he said, his professional mask slipping just enough to show his genuine pity. "Wire transfer or a corporate credit card only, and the card must clear immediately." "I am sorry." Jada collapsed onto the velvet vanity stool, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. Her perfect morning was shattering into a million sharp pieces. Brenda rushed to her side, stroking her hair and glaring at Julian as if he were the one who had stolen their money. "This is an outrage," Brenda snapped, her voice trembling with misplaced, righteous indignation. "When Richard finds out how you treated his future daughter-in-law, he will make sure your company never caters another event in this town again. You are making a huge mistake." Julian simply nodded, offering a tight, patronizing smile. He tapped his tablet, closing the invoice screen. "I will let my crew know to finish packing the trucks," he said, turning toward the door. The reality of the situation finally slammed into Jada. She looked up, her mascara slightly smeared, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. There was no magical banking error. Preston was not answering his phone because Preston probably just realized his trust fund was locked. The wealthy, powerful family she thought she was marrying into could not even afford to feed their own wedding guests. The society wedding of the year was about to become the most embarrassing disaster in the history of our family. And then, just as I knew she would, my mother slowly turned her head. Her frantic eyes scanned the room, looking for anyone she could use as a life raft to save her precious social standing. Her gaze bypassed the terrified makeup artists, the half-empty bottles of Prosecco, and the discarded silk ribbons. Her eyes locked directly onto me, sitting quietly in the corner. The panic in her face instantly hardened into a familiar toxic calculation. I saw the gears turning in her mind. She remembered the corporate credit card I used to pay for our family vacations. She remembered the quiet, comfortable life I lived, despite her constant belittling of my career. In her moment of absolute desperation, the daughter she constantly treated like a burden suddenly transformed into an open ATM. "Simone," my mother said, her voice dropping the frantic edge and adopting a sickeningly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. I placed my coffee cup on the small glass table next to me, resting my hands in my lap. I looked right back at her, keeping my expression completely unreadable. "Yes, Mom," I answered mildly. The trap was set. The catering company was walking out the door. The groom was missing in action. The fake wealth of the Sterling family was evaporating into thin air. And now the family that had spent my entire life pushing me to the side was about to ask me to save them. My mother crossed the room toward me, her heels sinking into the plush carpet. Her face had completely transformed. The bitter, condescending woman from the rehearsal dinner was gone, replaced by a desperately sweet mother who suddenly remembered she had 2 daughters. Jada trailed right behind her, clutching the edges of her silk robe like a frightened child. "Simone, honey." My mother started, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "You heard what that horrible man just said. There is clearly an issue with the Sterling's bank. You know how these massive trust funds work. The security protocols are so strict, they probably just froze the account by mistake." I did not nod. I just let her talk. "The thing is," my mother continued, waving her hand dismissively, "we need $45,000 right now to keep the caterers here. And I know your little consulting business has been doing okay lately. You live so modestly, Simone. You are 35, you are single, you have no kids and no mortgage. What else do you have going on? You must have some savings tucked away. Be a good big sister and put this on your credit card. Preston will reimburse you first thing on Monday morning." The audacity was almost beautiful in its execution. In one breath, she managed to insult my career, minimize my life choices, and demand $45,000 as if she were asking to borrow a tube of lipstick. Jada stood behind her, nodding vigorously, her tear-stained face looking at me with a mixture of entitlement and desperation. "Please, Simone," Jada begged, her voice cracking. "This is my wedding day. You cannot let them ruin it. You just cannot. If you have the money, you have to help me. I am your sister. I sat back in my chair and looked at the two of them. For decades, they had operated under the assumption that I owed them my unconditional support simply because we shared the same blood. They had isolated me, belittled me, and treated me as an afterthought. But the moment their meticulously constructed world began to collapse, I was expected to act as their financial safety net. A younger version of myself would have handed over the money just to buy a few moments of their fragile conditional love. But that version of me was dead and buried. "I will pay the caterer," I said quietly. My mother's face instantly relaxed into a triumphant smile. She reached out to pat my shoulder, but I held up a single finger, stopping her hand mid-air. "I will pay the $45,000. I continued, my voice dropping to a colder register. "But I am not doing it as a favor. And I am certainly not doing it on blind faith. If you want my money, we are doing this on my terms." "What do you mean, your terms?" my mother asked, her smile faltering. "It is a temporary loan, Simone, for your sister." I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. As the CEO of an acquisitions firm, I never traveled without my legal templates. I opened my documents folder and tapped on a standard short-form promissory note. I quickly typed in the principal amount of $45,000 and set the interest rate to a standard 8%. "I am treating this exactly like the business transaction it is," I explained, turning the screen so they could see the document. "I will authorize the payment, but Jada has to sign this legally binding promissory note first. It states that she is personally liable for the full amount plus interest. If Preston is as wealthy as you both claim he is, then he can easily wire me the funds on Monday, and the interest will be negligible. But if he does not pay, I am coming to you, Jada." Jada's mouth fell open in absolute horror. She stared at the digital contract as if it were a poisonous snake. "You want me to sign a contract?" she gasped. "Are you out of your mind? I am the bride. We are family. You cannot charge me interest to save my wedding." "This is so petty and jealous, Simone. You are only doing this to humiliate me." My mother stepped forward, her face flushing with anger. "Put that stupid tablet away, Simone. How dare you treat your own sister like a business client? Have you no shame? After everything I have sacrificed to give you a good life, this is how you repay us. By extorting your own flesh and blood on the most important day of her life." I stood up slowly. I was taller than both of them, and for the first time in my life, I let them feel the full weight of my presence. The quiet, obedient daughter was gone. "You came to me, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You cornered me and demanded my money to fix a mess that you and the Sterlings created. You have spent the last 6 months treating me like an embarrassment because I do not fit into your desperate social climbing fantasies. Last night, you let that man treat me like a maid. And now you expect me to hand over $45,000 without a single guarantee." I looked directly at Jada, who was trembling in her silk robe. "If Preston has the money, then this piece of paper means absolutely nothing," I told her logically. "You sign it, he pays me on Monday, and we all move on." "But you are hesitating. Why is that, Jada? Are you starting to realize that the man you are marrying might be completely broke?" "Shut up!" Jada screamed, covering her ears. "Do not you dare say that about him. Preston is rich. He is just having a banking issue." "Then sign the paper," I challenged, extending my digital pen toward her. "Sign it and prove me wrong. Or do not sign it and you can go out there and tell your 300 wealthy guests that you are serving them tap water and apologies for dinner. The choice is entirely yours. But you have exactly 2 minutes before the caterer drives off this property." The room was dead silent, save for the sound of my mother's heavy breathing. The 3 makeup artists in the corner were staring at the floor, pretending they were not witnessing the complete implosion of our family dynamic. Jada looked at our mother, searching for a way out, but Brenda had nothing left to say. The fake wealth had failed them. The manipulation was not working. The only thing left was my cold, hard cash. Jada let out a bitter, sobbing breath. She snatched the digital pen from my hand with trembling fingers. She practically violently scrawled her signature on the dotted line at the bottom of the tablet screen. A single tear dripped from her chin and landed on the glass surface as she thrust the device back into my chest. "I hate you," she whispered, venom dripping from every syllable. "You are dead to me after today." I took the tablet back, ensuring the signature was saved and automatically backed up to my secure cloud servers. I locked the screen and slipped the device back into my bag. "I have been dead to you for years, Jada," I replied, completely unbothered by her dramatic declaration. "Now fix your makeup. You have a wedding to attend." I turned my back on my mother and my sister, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own entitlement. I walked across the room toward the door where Julian, the head caterer, was waiting with his arms crossed. The look on his face told me he had heard everything, but he had the professional decency to keep his mouth shut. It was time to show them what real money actually looked like. I walked away from my mother and sister, leaving them in their cloud of panic and entitlement. I crossed the thick carpet of the bridal suite toward the heavy oak doors, where Julian, the head caterer, stood waiting. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his posture was rigid with professional impatience. He was fully prepared to walk out and leave the society wedding of the year, with empty tables and starving guests. I reached into my leather tote bag and bypassed my everyday wallet. Instead, I pulled out a slim brushed steel card holder. Inside that holder was my corporate credit card. It was not a standard piece of plastic. It was a heavy black titanium American Express Centurion card issued exclusively to the executive board of Vanguard Acquisitions. It is an invitation-only card, a financial instrument that you cannot simply apply for regardless of your income. It is handed to you only when your liquid assets and corporate spending eclipse the gross domestic product of small island nations. I slid the cold metal from the holder and extended it toward Julian. He uncrossed his arms and took the card from my hand. I watched his eyes drop to the piece of metal. The sheer physical weight of the titanium always caught people off guard, and Julian was no exception. His brow furrowed slightly as he felt the heavy, cold edge of the card. He looked up at me, his professional facade cracking just a fraction, but he remained silent. He pulled his silver tablet from under his arm, tapped the screen to reopen the final invoice, and swiped the black metal edge through the card reader attached to the device. Behind me, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from my mother Brenda and my sister Jada. They were standing perfectly still, holding their breath in the center of the room. I knew exactly what they were waiting for. They were waiting for the terminal to flash red. They were waiting for the transaction to be declined so they could mock my supposed modest savings and return to their comfortable narrative, where I was just the struggling, inadequate older sister who was trying to show off. They wanted me to fail because my failure validated their choices. The tablet chimed with a bright, cheerful beep. Approved. Instantly. There was no fraud prevention hold. There was no automated phone call from a concerned bank representative asking to verify a massive charge. $45,000 was transferred from my corporate account to the catering company as easily and seamlessly as buying a cup of coffee. Julian stared at the digital receipt glowing on his screen. His eyes traced the billing information authorized by the terminal. The name registered to the card was not just my personal name. It was the parent company, Vanguard Acquisitions. I watched the blood completely drain from Julian's face. The stern, uncompromising caterer who had just confidently threatened to walk out on the Sterling family suddenly looked like he had stepped directly onto an active landmine. His eyes darted frantically from the tablet screen up to my face and back down again. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He knew exactly who Vanguard Acquisitions was. We had recently bought out the primary wholesale food distribution network that supplied every elite catering company on the eastern seaboard, including his. I was not just a guest at this wedding paying a bill. I was functionally the person who owned the supply chain that kept his entire business afloat. He leaned in close to me, ensuring his voice would not carry across the large room to where my mother and sister were standing. "Ms. Simone," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly, losing all of its previous stern authority. From Vanguard Acquisitions. I had absolutely no idea. I kept my expression completely neutral and gave him a single barely perceptible nod. I am so incredibly sorry. Julian stammered, his polished demeanor entirely gone, replaced by raw professional terror. If I had known who you were, if I had any idea this was your family, we would not have charged you a single dime. We would have handled this disruption internally. Please accept my deepest apologies for the inconvenience today. I will personally oversee every single detail of the reception tonight. I took the heavy black titanium card from his shaking hand and slid it smoothly back into my steel holder. The contract was with Richard Sterling Julian. I replied, my voice quiet and steady. You did your job and you protected your business. I respect that. Now go set up the champagne tower and the carving stations. My sister is very thirsty and she has a long night ahead of her. Yes, ma'am, absolutely, Julian said, practically bowing as he backed toward the door. He was already rapidly typing on his wireless headset, commanding his crew outside to immediately unpack the trucks and start the elite service. The second the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, the atmosphere in the bridal suite drastically shifted. The suffocating panic that had gripped the room evaporated instantly, replaced by my family's trademark toxic entitlement. Jada let out a loud theatrical sigh of relief, collapsing dramatically onto the velvet sofa. She did not ask how I had access to that kind of money. She did not express a single ounce of gratitude for the fact that I had just saved her from absolute public humiliation. Finally, Jada huffed, turning her attention back to the massive vanity mirror and aggressively blending her concealer. Now the makeup artists can actually do their jobs without all this distracting financial drama. Honestly, Simone, if you had the money, you should have just offered it an hour ago, instead of making us beg and panic. You always have to make everything a big, dramatic production. My mother walked over to Jada, smoothing down the bride's silk robe, her own crisis completely forgotten. See, that was not so difficult, Brenda said dismissively, waving her hand in my direction without even looking at me. You did the right thing, Simone. Family steps up when it is required. Preston will have a check for you on Monday morning, and we can put this ugly little misunderstanding behind us forever. I did not bother correcting them. Let them enjoy their fragile delusion for a few more hours. I walked slowly back to my quiet chair in the corner of the room, sitting down and crossing my legs. But just as I picked up my coffee cup, the heavy door to the bridal suite swung open once again. In walked Catherine Sterling Preston's mother. Catherine was a sharp, angular white woman who moved with the predatory grace of someone who had spent her entire life defending her high society territory. She was draped in a custom-tailored silk suit and wore a massive diamond tennis bracelet that my Vanguard analysts had informed me was currently heavily leveraged against a second mortgage. Unlike her husband Richard, who was blinded by his own loud arrogance, Catherine was quiet and deeply observant. She had been standing in the hallway just outside the door. She had seen Julian the caterer rushing out of the room, looking absolutely terrified, barking orders at his staff with frantic urgency. She had seen him bowing his head to me in the doorway. And as she stepped into the suite, her cold blue eyes locked directly onto the black titanium card just before I slipped it back into my leather tote bag. Catherine did not look at Jada, the frantic bride. She did not look at my mother, who immediately began fawning over her arrival, praising her beautiful suit. Catherine looked directly across the room at me. Her gaze was piercing and deeply calculating. She had heard Julian whisper the name Vanguard Acquisitions in the hallway. She might not know the exact details of her husband's catastrophic financial ruin just yet, but a woman like Catherine survived in her cutthroat world by recognizing subtle shifts in power. She saw the heavy black corporate Amex. She saw the sheer terror in the caterer's eyes. She saw the calm, unbothered expression on my face as I sipped my dark roast coffee. For the first time since my family had aggressively entangled themselves with the Sterling dynasty, someone in their inner circle realized I was not the hired help. Catherine narrowed her pale eyes, her lips pressing into a thin, grim line. She knew something was horribly wrong with the power dynamic in this room, and as she stared at me from across the bridal suite, she slowly began to realize that she was looking right at the person who was going to burn her entire empire to the ground. I held Catherine's gaze for a long, terrifying moment. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply offered her the faintest shadow of a smile before turning my attention back to my coffee. She did not say a word. She just slowly backed out of the doorway and let the heavy oak door click shut behind her. The seed of absolute panic had been planted, and I knew she was going to spend the rest of the wedding mentally tearing her husband's financial records apart. Hours later, the sun went down, and the doors to the grand ballroom were thrown open for the reception. If the rehearsal dinner had been a desperate attempt at luxury, the wedding reception was a full-blown theatrical production of fake wealth. The room was dripping in an aggressive, opulent aesthetic that felt incredibly forced. There were massive, towering centerpieces of imported white orchids and rare hydrangeas on every single table. The floral budget alone must have been enough to put a down payment on a modest home. Ice sculptures carved into the shape of swans slowly melted near the raw seafood bar, where waiters stood ready to shuck oysters for anyone who asked. The chairs were draped in thick gold fabric, and the massive crystal chandeliers above were dimmed to cast a warm, romantic glow over the hundreds of guests. It was a picture-perfect society wedding, and absolutely none of it was paid for by the groom. I was seated at a small round table, tucked away in the far back corner of the room, directly next to the swinging kitchen doors. Traditionally, the sister of the bride and the maid of honor would be seated at the main head table with the wedding party. But my mother and Jada had carefully orchestrated the seating chart to ensure I was completely hidden from the main cameras and the elite guests. They placed me at a table with three distant elderly cousins who spent the entire evening complaining about their joints, and a couple of Preston's awkward college friends who were already deeply intoxicated and clearly did not want to be there. It was supposed to be a punishment. It was a calculated move designed to make me feel isolated, insignificant, and acutely aware of my lowly status in their newly elevated world. Instead, I found the placement absolutely perfect. It gave me an unobstructed tactical view of the entire ballroom, without requiring me to engage in any meaningless small talk. I sat quietly sipping my sparkling water and watching the tragic comedy unfold before my eyes. The emotional friction in the room was palpable to anyone paying attention. On one side, you had the Sterling family parading around like American royalty. Richard Sterling had fully recovered his arrogant swagger from the night before at the country club. He was walking from table to table, slapping men on the back and kissing the cheeks of wealthy socialites, playing the role of the generous billionaire patriarch with flawless execution. He was drinking top-shelf champagne that my corporate credit card had secured just a few hours prior. He was laughing and telling stories, completely blind to the fact that his entire empire had already been legally signed over to my firm. On the other side, you had my family. My mother Brenda was working the room with a manic, desperate energy that honestly made me feel a deep flicker of second-hand embarrassment. She had completely abandoned her own family members, leaving my aunts and uncles to fend for themselves while she fawned over Preston's relatives. I watched her practically corner a group of older white women near the edge of the polished wooden dance floor. She was laughing entirely too loud at jokes she probably did not understand, aggressively nodding in agreement with whatever they were saying. She was bending over backward to prove she belonged in their world, completely oblivious to the polite but condescending smiles they exchanged with one another the moment she turned her back. Brenda walked right past my corner table 3 different times without so much as a glance in my direction. I had saved her youngest daughter from total public humiliation. I had fronted $45,000 to ensure this lavish reception even existed. But in her mind, I had simply performed my required duty as the family scapegoat. I was a tool to be used in emergencies and then immediately put back in the box out of sight. Acknowledging me meant acknowledging the reality of where the money had actually come from, and Brenda preferred to live inside her beautiful, expensive lie. She wanted so desperately to believe that her daughter's marriage had permanently elevated her social standing. The grand entrance of the bride and groom was announced with a blast of triumphant orchestral music. Jada and Preston descended the grand sweeping staircase into the ballroom, while the crowd erupted into polite applause. Jada looked radiant, her face flushed with the ultimate victory. She was wearing a second custom gown for the reception, this one covered in intricate beadwork that caught the light of the chandeliers with every step. She clung to Preston's arm, looking up at him like he was the center of her entire universe. She had successfully secured the bag. She had the diamond ring, the prestigious name, and the elite status she had been chasing since we were teenagers. Preston looked incredibly smug. He waved to his fraternity brothers in the crowd and raised his glass to his father across the room. He possessed that specific brand of unearned confidence that only comes from generational wealth and an absolute lack of personal accountability. He genuinely believed he was superior to everyone in my family. He believed he was doing Jada a massive charitable favor by giving her his last name. He did not know that his massive trust fund was currently locked by a federal judge. He did not know that his inheritance was entirely non-existent. I watched them take their seats at the massive head table, positioned directly in the center of the room, surrounded by a wall of white roses. The servers, dressed in crisp white jackets, immediately began bringing out the first course. It was a delicate lobster bisque, followed by a salad of mixed winter greens and perfectly seared filet mignon. The food was immaculate. The presentation was flawless, and every single bite they took belonged to Vanguard Acquisitions. As the multi-course dinner service continued, I noticed Catherine Sterling sitting beside her husband at the head table. While Richard was busy boasting to the mayor and Jada was busy glowing for the wedding photographer, Catherine was completely rigid. She had barely touched her expensive wine. Her eyes kept scanning the room nervously, darting through the massive crowd until they eventually landed on my corner table in the back. Even from a distance, I could see the intense tension radiating from her stiff shoulders. She had clearly tried to confront Richard about the caterer and the credit card, but in a room full of high society guests, she could not risk causing a scene. So she was forced to sit there trapped in a beautiful designer gown, smiling for the cameras, while the dreadful realization of their impending financial ruin slowly suffocated her. I raised my glass of water in her direction, moving it just a fraction of an inch off the table. A silent toast between the only two women in the room who actually understood the mathematical reality of the situation. Catherine quickly looked away, her jaw clenched tight, her face turning slightly pale. The stark contrast between my quiet, absolute confidence and my family's desperate need for validation was striking. I did not need to wear a gown covered in crystals or laugh loudly at rich men's terrible jokes to feel powerful. True power was sitting in the back of the room entirely unnoticed, holding the deed to the building they were all currently dancing inside. They were celebrating a legacy that had already been quietly dismantled and packaged into a neat legal file sitting in my briefcase. The jazz music shifted to a slower tempo, signaling the end of the dinner service and the beginning of the formal speeches. The waiters moved swiftly through the tables, pouring the final round of champagne for the toasts. I watched as Richard Sterling wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, stood up from his chair, and buttoned his tailored tuxedo jacket. He tapped his crystal knife against his glass, demanding the attention of the room. The excited chatter slowly died down as all 300 guests turned their chairs toward the head table. My mother Brenda clasped her hands together under her chin, looking up at Richard with sheer adoration. Jada leaned her head against Preston's shoulder, ready to absorb the praise of her new father-in-law. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands calmly in my lap. The fake smiles, the forced luxury, and the pathetic social climbing were about to reach their absolute peak, and I was more than ready to watch them fall from the very top. Richard cleared his throat, tapping his crystal champagne flute with a silver butter knife. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of conversation, echoing across the cavernous ballroom. The jazz quartet immediately stopped playing. Waiters froze in their tracks, trays of half-empty plates balanced carefully on their shoulders. 300 faces turned toward the massive floral arrangement at the center of the head table. Richard grabbed the wireless microphone from its stand, adjusting his tailored tuxedo jacket with his free hand. He stood with his chest puffed out, soaking in the absolute silence of the room, like a king surveying his loyal subjects. "Welcome, everyone!" Richard began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He had that deep, practiced baritone that men of his specific background always seem to possess, a voice engineered to command boardrooms and intimidate subordinates. On behalf of Catherine and myself, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the union of our son Preston and his beautiful new bride Jada. A polite wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Richard smiled, raising his free hand to quiet them down. He spent the first 5 minutes of his speech doing exactly what I expected him to do. He talked exclusively about himself. He talked about the Sterling family legacy, recounting a highly sanitized version of how his grandfather had laid the foundation for their real estate empire. He spoke about the buildings they owned, the charities they allegedly supported, and the heavy burden of carrying such a prestigious name in modern society. It was a masterclass in narcissistic grandstanding. He was using my sister's wedding as a corporate promotional event, completely oblivious to the fact that his empire was currently nothing more than a hollow shell waiting to be crushed. Then he pivoted. He turned slightly to his right, looking down at Jada, who was gazing up at him with sheer reverence. Now, I must admit, Richard set his tone shifting into something dangerously patronizing when Preston first told us he was marrying a girl from outside our usual circle. We had our reservations. You all know how protective we are of our community. The room grew incredibly still. The wealthy guests leaned in, sensing the incoming microaggressions. My mother, Brenda, who was seated just a few chairs down from Jada, stiffened slightly, but maintained her rigid, artificial smile. But Jada Richard continued pacing slowly behind the head table. She has proven to be quite the exception. We have watched this young woman elevate herself in ways that are frankly remarkable. It is not easy coming from a modest urban background. It takes grit to pull yourself up out of that environment, to leave behind the limitations of your upbringing and assimilate so flawlessly into a world of true culture and refinement. She recognized the opportunity to better her station in life, and she took it. She is proof that with the right guidance and the right family name, anyone can be saved from their circumstances. My stomach turned. It was not a compliment. It was a racially coded verbal assault disguised as paternal affection. He had just stood in front of 300 elite guests and publicly summarized my sister's entire existence as a charity case. He painted our family as a dark, unfortunate stain that Jada had miraculously managed to scrub off simply by marrying a mediocre white man with a trust fund. And the most devastating part was watching my own family accept the insult. Jada practically beamed, batting her eyelashes and mouthing the words "thank you" to the man who had just insulted her entire bloodline. My mother, Brenda, was actually nodding along, wiping a single theatrical tear from her cheek. They were so desperate for a seat at the table that they were entirely willing to let Richard chop off their legs just to fit into the chairs. But Richard was not finished. A man like him never feels truly tall unless he is actively stepping on someone's neck. He needed a punchline to bring his terrible joke home, and he needed a stark contrast to highlight Jada's supposed transformation. His pale blue eyes scanned the massive ballroom, peering through the dim, romantic lighting. He looked right past the wealthy socialites and the local politicians. He looked past his own son. His gaze traveled all the way to the back of the room, settling squarely on my dark corner table by the kitchen doors. In fact, Richard chuckled, raising his glass slightly in my direction. I believe Jada's older sister is sitting all the way back there in the dark. Simone, isn't it? Hundreds of heads instantly swiveled in their chairs. Suddenly, the quiet anonymity of my corner table vanished. I could feel the collective weight of 300 pairs of eyes locking onto me. I did not shrink down. I did not look away. I remained perfectly still, my posture flawless, my expression entirely unreadable. "Yes, Simone," Richard boomed into the microphone, a cruel smirk spreading across his flushed face. "You know Preston now. that your new sister-in-law is officially part of the extended family, we should probably do the charitable thing and help her out. I hear she runs some little independent consulting gig. Maybe on Monday we can find a spot for her down in the Sterling Development mailroom. We can start her on minimum wage, teach her the value of $1, and show her how a real successful business actually operates. Who knows, if she works hard enough, maybe one day she can afford to buy a dress with a recognizable designer label. He delivered the punchline with the flawless timing of a seasoned bully. For one agonizing second, the ballroom was completely silent. And then the laughter broke. It started with Preston's college friends at the table next to mine, who let out loud, obnoxious howls of amusement. Then the laughter rippled forward, infecting the older guests. The wealthy socialites chuckled politely behind their manicured hands. The local politicians offered deep, rumbling laughs of agreement. The sound rolled through the opulent room, crashing over me like a suffocating wave of pure, concentrated disrespect. It was the sound of an entire room of privileged people collectively agreeing that my existence as an independent Black woman was inherently comical. But the laughter of the strangers was not what solidified my absolute lack of mercy. It was the laughter coming from the head table. I watched Preston throw his head back and laugh, clapping his father on the shoulder. I watched my mother Brenda cover her mouth with her napkin, her shoulders shaking as she giggled along with the crowd, sacrificing her eldest daughter to the altar of high society approval. And I watched Jada, my own sister, the woman whose entire wedding I had just salvaged from ruin, look directly at me and smile a wicked, triumphant little smile. She laughed because Richard had publicly confirmed the hierarchy she had always wanted. She was the successful, beautiful Sterling bride, and I was the bitter, struggling spinster sister who belonged in the mailroom. It was the ultimate public humiliation. It was designed to break my spirit, to remind me that no matter how hard I worked, I would always be viewed as less than by the people who gatekept this world. I looked down at the crystal glass of sparkling water resting in my hand. The ice cubes clinked softly against the sides. My heart rate had not increased by a single beat. My hands were not shaking. A strange, profound sense of peace washed over me entirely, replacing the anger. You cannot be humiliated by people you fundamentally do not respect. And you certainly cannot be threatened by people whose financial existence rests entirely in the palm of your hand. Let them laugh, I thought to myself, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water. Let them enjoy this brilliant, hilarious moment. Let Richard Sterling feel like the undisputed king of the world. Because every single person laughing in this magnificent ballroom was sitting on furniture that I now legally owned. They were eating food that my corporate account had paid for. They were celebrating a billionaire dynasty that currently had a net worth sitting in the negative millions. Richard had just told a room full of people that he was going to teach the CEO of Vanguard Acquisitions how a real business operates. The irony was so rich, so deeply intoxicating, that I almost let a genuine smile slip across my face. The laughter slowly died down, replaced by scattered applause, as Richard finished his toast and took a long, self-satisfied drink of his champagne. The jazz band smoothly transitioned back into a lively set, and the guests turned their attention back to their plates. The spotlight moved off me, but the heavy, lingering tension remained. My family had officially drawn their line in the sand. They had publicly chosen their side, and in doing so, they had completely absolved me of any lingering guilt for what I was about to do to them. The scattered applause faded into the background as the jazz quartet picked up a lively, upbeat tune. Waiters in pristine white jackets flooded the floor, expertly clearing the salad plates and pouring fresh champagne. The tension in the room dissolved back into the comfortable hum of wealthy people discussing their investment portfolios and summer homes. At the head table, Richard Sterling took his seat with a triumphant sigh, looking incredibly pleased with himself. My mother Brenda leaned over to clink her glass against his, offering a radiant smile of absolute submission. Jada was glowing, practically vibrating with the thrill of being publicly validated by the patriarch of her new family. I remained at my small table in the dark corner of the ballroom. I did not touch my food. I simply sat there watching the grand illusion continue to play out. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Preston was stepping down from the elevated platform of the head table. He adjusted his silk tie and began making his rounds through the massive ballroom. He was playing the perfect groom, shaking hands with the local politicians, kissing the cheeks of elderly socialites, and accepting their generous envelopes of cash. He moved with a loose, arrogant swagger. The combination of his father's racially coded speech and the expensive alcohol flowing through his veins had clearly inflated his ego to dangerous new heights. I watched him navigate the room. He was a man who had never been told no, a man who had never faced a single consequence for his actions. He believed that his last name was a magical shield that would protect him from the realities of the world forever. As he got closer to my side of the room, I noticed his eyes scanning the tables until they locked onto me. A slow, cruel smirk spread across his face. Preston could not just let the moment pass. People with fake power always feel a desperate need to enforce it. He sensed that his father's public insult had not broken me. He saw that I was not crying in the bathroom or storming out of the venue in a fit of rage. My quiet, unbothered presence in the back of the room was a direct threat to his fragile superiority. He needed to come over and make sure I knew exactly how small he thought I was. He bypassed a table of his own extended family and walked directly toward my dark corner. The elderly cousin sitting near me immediately sat up straighter, offering him polite, nervous smiles. Preston did not even acknowledge them. He walked right up behind my chair, placing one heavy hand on the wooden backrest and leaning down so his face was just inches from my ear. He smelled strongly of aged scotch and expensive cologne, a suffocating combination of wealth and poor decisions. "That was quite a speech my dad gave," Preston whispered, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "I saw you sitting all the way back here in the dark. I just wanted to come over and make sure there were no hard feelings." I turned my head slightly, looking at him from the corner of my eye. I did not speak. I simply let him dig his own grave. "Do not take it personally, Simone," he continued, leaning in even closer, so only I could hear him over the jazz music. "Not everyone is cut out for the big leagues. Jada is different. She understands how our world operates. She knows how to adapt, and she knows how to appreciate what a family like mine can do for her. But you do not need to feel bad that you cannot keep up. We are more than happy to let you experience a night like this. Just enjoy the champagne, eat the steak, take a few pictures. It is probably the only time you will ever get to see the inside of a place like this." Every single word out of his mouth was designed to put me in my place. He was treating me like a charity case, a pathetic outsider who had been graciously granted a temporary visitor pass to his elite kingdom. He wanted me to feel grateful for the crumbs falling from his table. I slowly turned my body in the chair, fully facing him. I looked directly into his pale blue eyes. I did not scowl. I did not snap back with an angry retort. Instead, I offered him a warm, polite, and utterly terrifying smile. It was the exact same smile I gave to arrogant CEOs right before I hostilely took over their companies and liquidated their assets. "Thank you, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly level and unnervingly calm. "I appreciate you coming over to clarify things. I will make sure to remember exactly where I stand in relation to your family." Preston chuckled, completely missing the deadly promise wrapped in my polite tone. He patted my shoulder with heavy, patronizing condescension. "That is the spirit," he said, standing back up and adjusting his jacket. "See you on the dance floor, Simone." He turned and walked away, strutting back toward his beautiful bride and his supposedly impenetrable legacy. He felt like an absolute king. He felt like he had successfully dominated the annoying older sister and secured his position at the top of the food chain. He was barely 10 steps away from my table when the secure corporate phone sitting inside my leather clutch vibrated. It was a sharp, double pulse. the specific notification tone I had set strictly for my executive legal team. I reached into the bag and pulled out the sleek device. The screen illuminated the dim corner of the ballroom, casting a pale blue light across my face. It was a highly encrypted message from Elias, the lead attorney at Vanguard Acquisitions. I tapped the screen, opening the secure portal. The message was short, precise, and completely devastating. The ink is dry. As of 8 o'clock tonight, Vanguard owns 85% of Sterling Development's outstanding debt. We hold the paper on everything: the commercial properties, the unfinished high-rises, and even their private estate. I read the words twice, letting the absolute magnitude of the message wash over me. Holding the paper on 85% of their debt meant that my firm was now the primary creditor for the entire Sterling bloodline. We controlled their mortgages, their corporate loans, and their lines of credit. If Richard Sterling wanted to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning, he would technically have to ask me for permission. The massive mansion Preston had been bragging about all night, the home Jada thought she was moving into tomorrow, it no longer belonged to them. It belonged to Vanguard. It belonged to me. I slowly pulled back the long tailored sleeve of my emerald crepe dress. The heavy gold face of my Rolex caught the light from the chandeliers above. I checked the time. It was exactly 8:15 p.m. I stared at the hands of the watch as the reality of the timeline settled into my mind. 15 minutes ago, Richard Sterling was standing on a stage, holding a microphone and publicly offering me a minimum wage job in his mailroom. 15 minutes ago, my mother and sister were laughing at my expense, completely secure in their belief that they had finally surpassed me. And less than 60 seconds ago, Preston had leaned over my shoulder to tell me I was not cut out for the big leagues. They were mocking me while they were already entirely financially ruined. While Richard was delivering his racist punchline, the final signatures were being stamped in a downtown law office. While Preston was telling me to enjoy the free champagne, my legal team was actively seizing the accounts that paid for it. They had spent the entire evening putting on a spectacular theatrical performance of absolute supremacy, completely unaware that the stage they were standing on had already been demolished. I pressed the side button on my phone, locking the screen and slipping it back into my clutch. I picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water and took a long, refreshing sip. The cold liquid felt incredible against my throat. The heavy, suffocating weight of my family's toxic expectations, the years of being the scapegoat, the constant, relentless microaggressions, it all simply evaporated into the warm air of the Oakbridge Country Club. I was no longer the discarded older sister sitting in the dark corner. I was the executioner. And I had just received the official green light to drop the blade. I looked across the ballroom at the head table. Jada was laughing, throwing her head back as Preston whispered something in her ear. Richard was pouring himself another glass of $1,000 scotch. They were so incredibly happy. They were at the absolute peak of their lives. I set my glass down on the table. The waiting period was officially over. It was time to introduce the Sterling family to the big leagues. The jazz quartet was in the middle of a lively saxophone solo when the massive double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom suddenly swung open. They did not just open, they were pushed apart with the kind of heavy, deliberate force that immediately commands attention. Two men stepped into the opulent space, flanked by a discreet but visibly armed security detail. The first was Governor Mitchell, a man whose face was plastered on every news station and billboard in the state. Beside him walked Thomas Wright, a prominent tech billionaire whose latest artificial intelligence acquisitions had recently placed him on the cover of global finance magazines. These were not men who attended local society weddings. These were men who moved global markets, who dictated state legislation, and who possessed the kind of stratospheric wealth that made Richard Sterling's country club aesthetic look like a child's lemonade stand. The effect their arrival had on the room was instantaneous and absolute. The saxophone player squeaked a sour note before pulling the gold instrument from his lips. The drummer stopped mid-beat. The low, comfortable hum of 300 wealthy guests discussing their summer homes and investment portfolios completely evaporated into thin air. The ballroom went entirely dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the silver champagne buckets. Every single eye in the room locked onto the two uninvited billionaires standing in the doorway. From my quiet vantage point in the dark corner by the kitchen doors, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the head table. Richard Sterling had been in the middle of pouring himself another glass of $1,000 scotch. When he looked up and saw Governor Mitchell and Thomas Wright, his hand actually trembled, causing the amber liquid to spill over the crystal rim and stain the pristine white tablecloth. His face underwent a rapid, terrifying transformation. The arrogant flush of his earlier speech drained completely, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. But that initial shock was almost immediately replaced by a frantic, manic desperation. I knew exactly why Richard was looking at them like a starving man staring at a feast. My financial analysts at Vanguard Acquisitions had uncovered the desperate paper trail weeks ago. For the past 2 years, Richard had been aggressively lobbying the governor's office and practically stalking Thomas Wright's investment firm. He had been begging for a meeting, pleading for a massive state-backed bailout or a tech partnership to save his rapidly failing real estate empire from total collapse. He had sent hundreds of frantic emails, made dozens of unreturned phone calls, and leveraged every single social connection he had just to get 5 minutes in a room with either of them. His company was bleeding cash, his investors were threatening lawsuits, and his creditors were circling like vultures. And now, by some miraculous twist of fate, the two men holding the keys to his salvation had just walked right into his son's wedding reception. Richard did not hesitate. He completely abandoned his expensive drink, leaving the heavy crystal bottle sitting in a puddle of spilled scotch. He shoved his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed against the elevated platform of the head table. He did not care. The polished, composed patriarch, who had just spent the last 2 hours lecturing the room on proper high society etiquette, was suddenly scrambling across the floor like a desperate beggar. As he rushed past his son, he reached out and grabbed Preston's arm with a bruising, aggressive grip. "Come with me, Richard," hissed his voice, carrying easily in the completely silent room. "Get your wife. Hurry up." Preston, caught completely off guard by his father's sudden erratic behavior, stumbled forward. He blindly reached back and grabbed Jada's hand, yanking her out of her chair without warning. Jada let out a small yelp of surprise, her heavy custom-beaded gown catching slightly on the table linen as she was dragged across the platform. The three of them moved across the polished wooden dance floor in a frantic, awkward procession. Richard was practically tripping over his own custom leather shoes, his eyes locked onto the governor and the billionaire with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. He was sweating heavily now, his neatly combed silver hair suddenly looking slightly disheveled. He was convinced this was his golden moment. He genuinely believed his legacy, his name, and his sheer proximity to wealth had somehow magically summoned these titans of industry to rescue him from his impending ruin. He thought they had finally recognized his importance and come to pay their respects to the Sterling dynasty. My mother Brenda had stood up from her chair at the head table, her hands clasped tightly under her chin. She was vibrating with excitement, completely misreading the entire situation. She thought this was the ultimate validation of her life choices. She thought the governor of the state had come to personally bless her daughter's marriage. She was already looking around the room at the other wealthy guests, making sure they were witnessing her proximity to absolute power. She was ready to brag about this moment for the rest of her natural life. I remained seated in the shadows, entirely unbothered by the spectacle unfolding in front of me. I crossed my legs and rested my chin on my hand, watching Richard Sterling march directly toward his own execution. He was a man who had spent his entire life judging people based on their pedigree and the balance of their bank accounts. He had just publicly humiliated me because he thought I lacked the capital to defend myself. He was about to learn a very painful lesson about what happens when you attempt to play the game of capitalism with people who actually own the board. Governor Mitchell and Thomas Wright had not moved from the entrance. They were not mingling, they were not grabbing flutes of champagne from the frozen waiters. They stood just inside the heavy double doors, their security detail forming a subtle but firm perimeter around them. Their eyes were scanning the massive, dimly lit ballroom, actively searching for someone specific. Richard finally reached them, stopping just a few feet away. He threw his shoulders back, taking a deep breath to compose himself and desperately trying to resurrect the arrogant swagger he had displayed during his racially coded toast. He plastered a massive, eager smile across his flushed face and extended his hand toward the governor. Governor Mitchell Richard projected his voice, speaking loud enough for the closest tables to hear clearly, attempting to establish dominance in front of his wealthy peers. What an absolute honor! I am Richard Sterling. We have been trying to coordinate a meeting with your office for quite some time. And Thomas, it is a profound pleasure to finally have you at Oakbridge. Welcome to my son's wedding. This is Preston and his beautiful new bride, Jada. We are absolutely thrilled you could make the time to join our celebration tonight. Preston stood tall, puffing out his chest, trying to mimic his father's false confidence. He adjusted his silk tie and offered a firm, practiced nod to the billionaire. Jada offered her most dazzling, rehearsed smile, dipping her head slightly in a gesture of deep respect. She was practically glowing, bathing in the reflected glory of the men standing in front of her. This was the exact peak of society she had dreamed of reaching since she was a little girl. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with billionaires and politicians, entirely convinced that she belonged exactly where she was. They stood there, a picture-perfect portrait of a powerful American dynasty, extending their hands in greeting to the men who controlled the state. They waited for the governor to smile back. They waited for Thomas Wright to shake their hands and congratulate the happy couple. They waited for the ultimate validation that would prove they resided at the very top of the world. I watched from my quiet table in the back, my corporate phone resting safely inside my leather clutch, containing the encrypted legal documents that proved Richard Sterling did not even own the tuxedo he was currently wearing. The silence in the ballroom stretched out, becoming heavy and incredibly suffocating. 300 wealthy guests held their breath, watching the interaction at the front doors. I kept my eyes locked on the governor's face, waiting for the exact moment the Sterling family illusion completely and irreversibly shattered. Richard Sterling stood with his arm fully extended, his hand hovering in the empty space between himself and the two most powerful men in the state. He had completely abandoned all protocol and dignity in his desperate rush to the door. His chest was puffed out, his tailored tuxedo jacket straining slightly at the buttons, and his face was frozen in a massive, eager smile that looked more like a grimace of pure panic. He had delivered his introductory speech with the volume and theatricality of a man who firmly believed he was the main character of the universe. He genuinely expected Governor Mitchell to stop in his tracks, grasp his hand with equal enthusiasm, and offer a loud, jovial greeting that would validate the Sterling family dynasty in front of all 300 wealthy guests. Governor Mitchell did not even slow his pace. The governor was a man who navigated crisis for a living. He dealt with federal budgets, state emergencies, and international trade agreements. To him, a failing local real estate developer was not a peer or a person of interest. Richard was simply an obstacle standing in the doorway of a room he needed to enter. The governor stopped just short of Richard's outstretched hand. He did not smile. He did not offer a polite word of congratulations for the wedding. He did not even acknowledge Preston or Jada, who were standing right next to Richard, glowing with naive anticipation. Instead, Governor Mitchell looked down at Richard's extended hand for a fraction of a second, as if trying to understand why this sweating, desperate man was blocking his path. Then he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Richard. The look the governor gave him was completely devoid of warmth or recognition. It was a look of cold, clinical evaluation. It was the exact same look you might give a stranger who accidentally bumps into you on a crowded sidewalk. Without uttering a single syllable, the governor gave Richard a curt, dismissive nod. It was not a nod of greeting. It was a physical command to move out of the way. It was the absolute lowest form of nonverbal communication, a microscopic acknowledgement that a human being was occupying space in front of him and nothing more. Before Richard could even process the devastating reality of that nod, Governor Mitchell simply stepped around him. He shifted his weight to the right, completely bypassing Richard's outstretched hand, and walked smoothly into the grand ballroom. Thomas Wright, the billionaire tech mogul walking closely beside the governor, was even more brutal in his dismissal. He did not even bother to offer a nod. His eyes were scanning the dim, romantic lighting of the opulent room, completely ignoring the Sterling family as if they were literally invisible. When Richard instinctively took a half-step forward, trying to block their path and force an interaction, the private security detail instantly intervened. A massive man in a dark suit stepped smoothly between Richard and the billionaires, lightly pressing the back of his hand against Richard's chest. It was not a violent shove, but it was an immovable physical barrier. The security guard did not look at Richard either. He simply swept him aside like a piece of inconvenient furniture, allowing the two titans of industry to continue their search of the room uninterrupted. Richard Sterling was left standing entirely alone in the center of the entranceway, his arms still extended into the empty air. The physical manifestation of his irrelevance was so stark and so absolute that it was almost painful to watch. The massive, eager smile slowly melted off his flushed face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw went slack. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. He looked down at his own empty hand, as if he could not comprehend why it was not currently shaking the hand of the governor. For a man whose entire identity was built on the foundation of his perceived social dominance, this public rejection was not just embarrassing, it was entirely fatal. He slowly let his arm drop to his side. His shoulders slumped forward entirely, deflating the arrogant posture he had carried all night. The illusion of his power had been punctured and stripped away in less than 5 seconds. Beside him, Preston looked completely lost. Preston had spent his entire 33 years on this earth, watching people bow down to his father. He had been conditioned to believe that the Sterling name was a magical key that opened every single door in the state. He had just confidently pulled his new bride across the room, fully expecting to be embraced by billionaires. Now he stood there, shifting his weight awkwardly, his mouth slightly open, staring at the backs of the governor and the tech mogul as they walked away. Preston looked at his father, waiting for Richard to do something to fix the situation, to shout a command or assert his authority. But Richard had nothing left. The big leagues. Preston had so arrogantly bragged to me about just minutes ago had arrived, and they had instantly relegated his family to the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. Jada was perhaps the most devastated of them all. The radiant, triumphant glow that had illuminated her face all evening was entirely extinguished. She was still clutching Preston's arm, but her grip was no longer affectionate, it was tense and rigid. She had worn her heavy, custom-beaded gown like a suit of armor, believing it proved she finally belonged in this elite world. But standing there, ignored and bypassed by the only people in the room who truly mattered, she suddenly looked incredibly small. She looked around the room, her eyes wide with sudden panic, realizing that every single person in the ballroom had just witnessed her new family being treated like absolute garbage. The silence in the grand ballroom had shifted from shocked anticipation to a heavy, suffocating judgment. 300 wealthy guests had watched the entire interaction play out. In high society, perception is reality. The moment the guests saw Governor Mitchell step around Richard Sterling as if he were carrying a contagious disease, the social currency of the Sterling family immediately plummeted to zero. The whispers began. They started softly at the tables closest to the entrance and quickly spread across the massive room like a wildfire. Women leaned behind their hands, murmuring to their husbands. Men exchanged knowing glances and raised their eyebrows in silent communication. They were ruthless. These were people who only associated with winners, and Richard had just been publicly branded as a loser by the highest authority in the room. They knew Richard had been begging for a bailout, and seeing him so casually dismissed confirmed every single rumor about his impending financial ruin. The people who had been laughing at his terrible jokes and drinking his expensive champagne just 20 minutes ago were now actively distancing themselves from his sinking ship. I sat in my chair in the dark corner of the ballroom, feeling a deep, profound sense of poetic justice wash over me. Just 24 hours ago, I had stood in the country club foyer and extended my hand to Richard in a gesture of polite respect. He had looked at me with absolute disgust, ignored my hand, and tossed his damp, heavy overcoat onto my arm. He had treated me like I was invisible because I did not possess the specific aesthetic of wealth he worshipped. Now the universe had returned the favor with terrifying precision. Richard had extended his hand to the governor, desperately begging for respect, and he had been handed the exact same cold, silent dismissal he had given me. The only difference was that when Richard ignored me, I had quietly walked to the bar and bought his entire bloodline. When the governor ignored Richard, Richard had absolutely no recourse. He had no secret leverage. He had no hidden capital. He was just a broke, desperate old man standing in a rented tuxedo watching his fake empire crumble in front of 300 people. My mother Brenda, who had been practically vibrating with excitement at the head table, was now completely frozen. Her hands were still clasped under her chin, but her smile had turned into a rigid, terrified grimace. She did not understand the intricate financial dynamics at play, but she possessed a primal understanding of social humiliation. She saw the whispers. She felt the sudden icy shift in the room. The powerful dynasty she had forced me to subsidize and manipulated my sister into marrying was being publicly humiliated, and she had tethered her entire identity to their sinking vessel. Governor Mitchell and Thomas Wright continued their steady pace across the polished wooden dance floor, completely unbothered by the trail of psychological destruction they had just left at the front doors. Their security detail moved flawlessly with them, parting the sea of lavishly decorated tables and stunned guests. They were not wandering aimlessly. Their eyes were locked on a specific destination. They walked straight past the massive, towering centerpieces of white orchids. They walked past the melting ice sculptures and the raw seafood bar. They bypassed the wealthy socialites and the local politicians who were desperately trying to make eye contact with them. They were heading directly toward the dark, quiet corner in the back of the room. They were heading directly toward my table. The guests watched in stunned silence as Governor Mitchell and Thomas Wright navigated the labyrinth of tables. They moved with absolute purpose, completely ignoring the desperate wealthy socialites and local politicians who were silently begging for their attention. They bypassed the lavishly decorated centerpieces, the melting ice sculptures, and the expensive seafood bars. They were walking straight toward the darkest, least significant corner of the Oakbridge Country Club ballroom. They were walking directly toward me. The elderly cousins sitting at my table entirely stopped breathing. They froze in their chairs, their eyes wide with sheer terror, unsure if they should stand up or simply melt into the floorboards. Across the room near the head table, my mother Brenda stretched her neck trying to understand what was happening. Her meticulously crafted worldview was actively short-circuiting. She could not comprehend why the two most important men in the entire state were walking away from the Sterling family and heading straight for the kitchen doors. I did not stand up immediately. I simply placed my crystal glass of sparkling water down on the table, resting my hands calmly in my lap. I watched them approach, waiting until they were exactly 5 feet away. The private security details seamlessly stopped, forming a subtle protective half-circle facing outward to keep the curious guests at bay. Then I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored emerald dress. Governor Mitchell's stern professional demeanor, the same cold expression that had just devastatingly dismissed Richard Sterling, instantly melted away. His face lit up with a warm, genuine smile of absolute respect. He did not extend his hand for a formal, rigid handshake. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and pulled me into a massive, respectful hug. "Simone," he said, his voice booming, carrying effortlessly over the thick, heavy silence of the room. "I was hoping I would catch you here tonight. Congratulations on the massive Sterling buyout. Vanguard saved the city a massive headache today." Thomas Wright, the billionaire tech mogul, stepped up right beside him, offering a firm, aggressive handshake. "Brilliant play," Simone Thomas added, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Your legal team moved faster than anyone on Wall Street anticipated. Acquiring 85% of their debt in a single afternoon is absolutely going to be taught in business schools next semester." You outmaneuvered every single bank in the district. If an actual bomb had detonated in the center of the ballroom, it would have caused significantly less psychological damage than those spoken words. The jazz band, which had been awkwardly trying to maintain a low background melody, completely lost their rhythm. The saxophone player dropped his instrument from his lips. The drummer froze mid-beat. The music abruptly cut out, leaving a hollow, ringing silence that violently amplified every single gasp in the room. 300 elite guests were staring at the quiet black woman in the dark corner, trying to process the impossible reality that she was the CEO of Vanguard Acquisitions. I looked over the governor's shoulder, looking straight through the crowd directly at the head table. Richard's face had turned the color of wet ash. The realization hit his body with the physical force of a speeding freight train. The massive, suffocating debt he had been frantically trying to outrun, the total financial ruin he had been begging these exact men to save him from, was now entirely owned by the woman he had just publicly humiliated. The woman he had jokingly offered a minimum wage job in his mailroom was the undisputed architect of his total destruction. Beside him, Preston was staring at me with his mouth hanging wide open. The smug, arrogant superiority that had defined his entire existence completely evaporated. His hand went entirely limp, and the crystal champagne flute he was holding slipped right through his fingers. It hit the polished wooden dance floor and shattered into 100 pieces. The sharp, violent sound of the breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the dead, silent ballroom. Jada and Brenda were paralyzed, staring at me in absolute unblinking shock. Their brains simply could not process the data. They had spent my entire life diminishing me, belittling my career, and treating me as the family scapegoat. Now the sister they had forced to sit in the dark was standing shoulder to shoulder with billionaires, casually receiving high-level praise for buying their new family's entire empire for pennies on the dollar. Jada looked down at her heavy custom-beaded gown, suddenly realizing that the prestigious sterling legacy she had married into was nothing more than a spectacular mirage. The bag she thought she had secured was completely empty. The shock on Richard's face, however, did not last long. The human ego, especially, one as bloated and fragile as his, cannot survive that level of catastrophic public humiliation without violently fighting back. His shock rapidly curdled into aggressive, frantic denial. His brain refused to accept that a woman like me had outsmarted a man like him. Richard shoved past his own son, stepping directly over the shattered glass of the champagne flute, and stormed across the dance floor. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched past the wealthy guests, who were now actively shrinking away from him, pulling their chairs back so they would not be associated with the blast radius of his total collapse. He pushed aggressively past the perimeter of the security detail. The armed guards immediately tensed, prepared to tackle him to the ground, but they only let him through because Governor Mitchell raised a single hand, calmly permitting the confrontation. Richard stopped just 2 feet away from us. His mask of high society elegance completely slipped away, revealing the terrified, cornered, desperately small man underneath. He looked wildly between the governor and me, his eyes darting back and forth in pure panic. He pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "What buyout?" Richard aggressively demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "What buyout? There is no buyout. You are mistaken, Governor. She is just a freelancer. She is nobody. She runs a little consulting gig out of her apartment. She is my daughter-in-law's sister, for God's sake." Governor Mitchell looked at Richard with a mixture of deep pity and utter disgust. He did not step back. He did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted his suit jacket and delivered the final fatal blow to Richard's sanity. "Richard," the governor said, his tone dripping with cold, absolute authority, "the State Banking Commission signed off on the transfer of your assets to Vanguard Acquisitions at 8 o'clock tonight. Simone here is the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard. She owns your commercial properties. She owns your unfinished high-rises. She owns the debt on your private estate. You have been running a bankrupt shell company for 3 years, and she just bought the entire hollow shell. I highly suggest you lower your voice and show some respect to your primary creditor." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Richard stared at the governor and then slowly, agonizingly turned his gaze back to me. The frantic denial in his eyes finally shattered, replaced by the cold, terrifying realization of his new reality. He had insulted me. He had treated me like garbage. He had laughed at me in front of 300 people. And now I held the legal rights to every single thing he had ever built. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there, bathed in the dim light of the country club chandeliers, projecting the quiet, lethal confidence of a woman who had already won the war before the other side even realized they were fighting. "Richard." I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "I believe we need to have a very private conversation about the future of your family." I did not wait for his response. I turned and looked directly at the heavy oak doors leading to the private bridal suite just off the main ballroom. I gave a slight nod to my private security team, who had been quietly standing by the exits all evening. The trap had been flawlessly sprung. The public execution was over, and it was time for the private autopsy. The moment the words left my mouth, Richard completely snapped. The remaining shreds of his carefully cultivated high society facade disintegrated. Fueled by a toxic cocktail of sheer panic and the agonizing sting of public humiliation, he lunged forward. His massive hand clamped down hard around my left bicep. It was not the firm, polite grip of a gentleman offering an escort. It was the desperate, bruising grip of a drowning man trying to drag someone else under the water with him. He aggressively yanked me forward, steering me away from the stunned gaze of the governor and the 300 silent guests. My private security detail immediately stepped inward, their hands reaching for the earpieces tucked behind their ears, ready to physically drop him to the floor. I caught the eye of my lead guard and offered a single sharp shake of my head. I held up my free hand, signaling them to stand down. I wanted this isolation. I wanted Richard to feel like he was still in control of the situation for just one more minute. I let him drag me across the polished wooden dance floor toward the heavy oak doors of the private bridal suite located just off the main ballroom. Preston immediately followed his father, his face pale and completely bewildered. He reached back and grabbed Jada's hand, pulling her along behind him. Jada stumbled in her heavy, custom-beaded gown, looking like a terrified child being dragged into the principal's office. My mother, Brenda, brought up the rear, practically sprinting in her expensive high heels to keep pace with us. Her face was a tragic mask of absolute confusion. She had tethered her entire social identity to a ship that had just hit an iceberg, and she was desperately running toward the captain, hoping he could somehow patch the massive hole. Richard shoved the heavy oak door open with his shoulder and forcefully pulled me into the dimly lit suite. He released my arm, giving me a final aggressive push toward the center of the room. Preston, Jada, and Brenda rushed in right behind us. Richard spun around and slammed the door shut. The heavy, thick wood sealed perfectly within its frame, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the ballroom. The sudden silence in the bridal suite was heavy and suffocating. The room was still a chaotic mess from the morning preparations. Discarded white tulle was draped over the velvet chairs. Half-empty bottles of Prosecco sat warming on the glass tables. The lingering smell of expensive hairspray and wilting roses hung thick in the stagnant air. Richard did not waste a single second. The moment the door clicked shut, he turned his entire body toward me, his face practically purple with explosive rage. He marched forward, stopping just inches from my face. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest. "You listen to me, you arrogant little fraud!" Richard screamed, his voice echoing harshly off the vanity mirrors. "I do not know what kind of sick, elaborate stunt you think you are pulling tonight. I do not know how you managed to trick the governor into walking over to your table, but I am not going to let you ruin my son's wedding with your bitter, pathetic jealousy." He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored tuxedo jacket. The smell of stale $1,000 scotch and cold, terrified sweat radiated off his skin. He was trying to use his physical size and his booming voice to shrink me down to intimidate me back into the obedient, subservient role he believed I belonged in. "You think you can play games with my family?" Richard continued, stepping even closer, invading my physical space. "You think because you run some little freelance consulting gig, you can walk into my country club and disrespect me? I will have you thrown out into the street. I will make sure you never work in this state again. You are nothing. You are absolutely nothing." I stood perfectly still. I let him yell. I let him expend the very last reserves of his fake authority. I watched the spittle fly from his lips and listened to the desperate cracking in his voice. He was throwing a temper tantrum because the universe had finally refused to bend to his will. When he paused to take a ragged breath, he reached out again. He brought his heavy hand up, attempting to grab my shoulder to physically shake me into submission. I did not flinch. I did not step back or cower away. Instead, I raised my right arm and slapped his hand away with a sharp, violent crack that echoed loudly through the entire suite. The physical impact was loud and absolute. It was not a defensive flutter. It was a calculated strike of pure dominance. Richard stumbled back a half step, clutching his stinging hand to his chest. His pale blue eyes went wide with profound shock. He had never in his entire privileged life had a woman, much less a black woman, physically reject his authority with such effortless contempt. "Do not ever put your hands on me again, Richard," I said, my voice dropping an entire octave. I stripped away every single ounce of the polite restraint I had carried all evening. My tone was cold, flat, and entirely lethal. The power dynamic in the room instantly violently shifted. I stepped forward, entirely reversing the physical space. Richard instinctively took another step back, his heel bumping into the edge of a velvet sofa. I was no longer the quiet older sister sitting in the dark corner of the ballroom. I was no longer the family scapegoat absorbing my mother's toxic expectations. I shed the disguise completely. I stood tall, my posture flawless, projecting the absolute terrifying authority of the apex predator in the room. Preston tried to intervene, stepping out from behind his father. His voice was shaking, his arrogant swagger completely evaporated. "Simone, you need to calm down and show my father some respect," Preston stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "You cannot just assault him." I turned my head slowly, locking my gaze onto Preston. "Respect is for people who can afford to pay their own catering bills, Preston," I replied smoothly. Preston snapped his mouth shut, his face turning bright red. Behind him, Jada let out a small, pathetic whimper. She collapsed onto the velvet vanity stool, burying her face in her hands. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down on her. She had spent the entire morning screaming at the caterer, demanding I use my modest savings to fix a banking error. Now she was sitting in the wreckage, realizing that her perfect billionaire groom was nothing more than a broke man living on borrowed time. My mother, Brenda, was standing perfectly still by the door. She looked completely terrified. She was staring at me as if she had never seen me before in her entire life. For 35 years, she had controlled me through guilt and emotional manipulation. She had constantly told me I was not good enough, not refined enough, not successful enough to matter. But standing in this room watching me physically back down a man she considered a god, she finally realized she had absolutely no power over me anymore. I ignored their panic and walked over to the large glass vanity table. I pushed aside a discarded makeup bag and a tangled pile of silk ribbons. I placed my heavy leather tote bag onto the glass surface. The satisfying thud of the bag hitting the table made Richard flinch. He watched my every move with the paranoid intensity of a trapped animal. He wanted to keep yelling. He wanted to keep threatening me. But the sheer predatory calm I was projecting had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. The illusion of his powerful dynasty was dead on the floor. We were now operating entirely in my world under my rules, and there was absolutely no room left for his arrogant delusions. I slowly unzipped the top of my heavy leather tote bag. The metallic sound of the zipper was the only noise in the quiet, suffocating space of the bridal suite. I reached inside and pulled out a massive, thick black leather binder. It was incredibly heavy, packed with hundreds of pages of highly sensitive financial documents, forensic accounting reports, and legally binding transfer deeds. My team at Vanguard Acquisitions had spent the last 90 days meticulously compiling every single piece of data inside it. I lifted the binder high enough for everyone in the room to see the embossed silver letters on the cover before dropping it directly onto the center of the glass vanity table. The heavy, violent thud made Jada jump in her seat. Her custom beaded gown rustled loudly as she shrank back. My mother Brenda gasped, clutching her hands to her chest. Richard stared at the black binder as if it were a live explosive device. His pale blue eyes were locked onto the Vanguard logo. The aggressive, arrogant posture he had tried to weaponize against me moments ago completely evaporated. He knew exactly what that binder represented. "Let us skip the theatrics, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly steady and echoing with brutal clinical precision. "You want to know what kind of elaborate stunt I am pulling tonight? I am not pulling a stunt. I am performing a corporate autopsy, and your company is the corpse." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood frozen, his chest heaving under his rented tuxedo. I opened the binder, flipping past the title page and the executive summary. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Richard, watching the last remaining drops of blood drain from his face. For the last 3 years, I continued tapping my manicured finger against the top document. "You have been running Sterling Development as a high-end Ponzi scheme. You lost your primary anchor tenants in your downtown commercial properties 36 months ago. The market shifted and your outdated business model could not keep up. But instead of declaring bankruptcy and restructuring your debt like a responsible businessman, you decided to hide the massive losses to protect your precious high society image. You started soliciting capital from new private investors, promising them guaranteed returns on luxury high-rise developments that you never actually had the permits to build." Richard took a shaky step backward, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked like a man who was watching his entire life flash before his eyes. "You took their money, Richard," I stated, my voice cold and unforgiving. "And you used it to quietly pay the interest on your older defaulted loans. You falsified collateral documents. You leveraged every single asset you owned 3 times over just to maintain your country club membership and keep buying your son expensive European sports cars. You built a spectacular house of cards on a foundation of absolute fraud." Preston stepped out from behind his father, his brow furrowed in deep panicked confusion. He looked back and forth between Richard and the open binder on the table. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Preston asked, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "Tell her she is crazy. Tell her about the offshore trusts. Tell her about the massive development deal in the city." Richard did not look at his son. He could not tear his eyes away from the financial records I had laid out in front of him. He knew I had the exact numbers. He knew the offshore trusts were completely empty. He knew the massive development deal was a complete fabrication he had invented to keep his family ignorant of their impending ruin. "There are no offshore trusts, Preston," I answered for him, turning the page of the binder to reveal a detailed spreadsheet of their frozen accounts. "Your father has been drowning in toxic, unmanageable debt for years. When the federal interest rates shifted last quarter, his little house of cards finally collapsed. The banks audited his accounts and realized the collateral he pledged was entirely fabricated. They called in his loans, all of them, at once." Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, desperate whisper. "How did you get these files?" he asked, his hands gripping the edge of the glass vanity table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Who gave these to you? You are just a freelance consultant. You are a nobody. You do not have the clearance for this kind of corporate data." I smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that reached my eyes, but offered absolutely no warmth to the men standing in front of me. "I am not a freelancer, Richard. I said slowly, enunciating every single syllable so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. I am the founder and the chief executive officer of Vanguard Acquisitions. I built my firm from the ground up to hunt down arrogant, financially illiterate men exactly like you. I spent the last decade accumulating actual capital while you spent your time accumulating fake prestige. When the regional banks realized your debt was toxic, they panicked. They wanted it off their books before the federal regulators caught wind of your massive fraud. So my firm swooped in. We bought your entire portfolio of debt for pennies on the dollar. I paused, letting the absolute finality of my words sink deep into his skin. I am not just your creditor, Richard, I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet suite. I am your owner. I hold the paper on the commercial buildings you claim to develop. I hold the paper on the country club we are currently standing inside. I even hold the paper on the massive private estate you sleep in every single night. I bought it all. Richard let out a strangled, pathetic noise that sounded like a wounded animal. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily onto the edge of the velvet sofa, his head falling into his hands. The great and powerful patriarch of the Sterling dynasty, the man who had confidently ordered me to fetch his coat 24 hours ago, was utterly destroyed, reduced to a trembling, sobbing mess in a rented tuxedo. I turned my attention away from the broken old man and focused entirely on his son. Preston was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The arrogant, smug groom who had just leaned over my shoulder to tell me I was not cut out for the big leagues was now actively hyperventilating. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape route, a legal loophole, or a punchline to a terrible joke that was never going to come. "You lied to me, Preston!" Jada suddenly shrieked, standing up from the vanity stool. "You told me you were worth $50 million. You told me my diamond ring was a priceless family heirloom. You told me we were moving into the private estate next month." Preston held his hands up defensively, backing away from his furious new wife. "Jada, baby. I did not know," he pleaded, tears welling up in his pale blue eyes. "I swear to you, I had no idea. My dad handles all the finances. He told me everything was fine. He told me the trust fund was secure for the next 50 years. I stepped toward Preston, closing the physical distance between us, until I was standing right in his face. I looked him up and down, taking in his expensive silk tie, his custom-tailored suit, and the heavy gold watch strapped to his wrist. Everything he was wearing was a lie funded by the massive debt he now owed my firm. "Your family does not have old money, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You have old debt. You have generations of unchecked borrowing wrapped up in a false sense of racial and social superiority. You thought your last name made you invincible. You thought you could walk through the world treating people like garbage because your grandfather built a few buildings half a century ago. But the reality is, you have never worked a hard day in your miserable, sheltered life. You are a parasite feeding off a dying host." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He was literally shaking his chest, rising and falling in rapid, panicked breaths. And as of an hour ago, I continued, leaning in so close he could probably feel the cold chill radiating off my skin. "You owe it all to me. Every single dime. The luxury cars, the estate, the clothes on your back. It all legally belongs to Vanguard Acquisitions. You are officially, functionally homeless. Welcome to the big leagues, Preston. I highly suggest you learn how to update a resume because you are going to need a real job by Monday morning." I stepped back, letting him absorb the full, devastating impact of his new reality. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. He clamped a trembling hand over his mouth and staggered backward, sinking into a chair next to his devastated, weeping father. The destruction of the Sterling family was complete. They had walked into this room as billionaires, and they were going to walk out as bankrupt frauds facing immediate federal indictment. I had systematically dismantled their entire empire without raising my voice, without breaking a sweat, and without seeking a single ounce of their validation. But my work in this room was not quite finished. I slowly turned my head away from the sobbing Sterling men and locked my gaze onto the two women standing silently by the door. It was time to address my mother and my sister. It was time to finally settle the family tab. I turned slowly away from the pathetic men shrinking into the velvet furniture and locked my eyes onto my sister. Jada was no longer a glowing, radiant bride. The pristine illusion she had built her entire life around was cracking and violently falling apart right in front of her. She looked at Preston, and the absolute disgust on her face was so intense it was almost hard to watch. She took a heavy step toward him, her custom-beaded gown dragging across the floor like an anchor chaining her to a sinking ship. "You promised me!" Jada screamed, her voice sharp and hysterical, echoing against the large vanity mirrors. "You looked me in my eyes and promised me we were moving into the private estate. You told me we were spending a month in the Maldives for our honeymoon and that I would never have to work another day in my life. You let me plan a wedding for 300 of the wealthiest people in this state, knowing you could not even afford to pay for the dinner plates. You are an absolute fraud, Preston. You are completely broke and you dragged me down with you." Preston cowered away from her, his hands raised defensively to protect his face, as if he expected her to physically strike him. He stammered out half-formed apologies, whining that he was a victim too, that his father had kept him entirely in the dark regarding the financial ruin of their company. But Jada was not listening to his excuses. She did not care about his feelings or his supposed innocence. She cared exclusively about the money, the status, and the elite last name she thought she had purchased with her youth and beauty. She realized in that exact, agonizing moment that she had traded her entire future for a worthless piece of paper and a mountain of toxic debt. She shrieked at him, calling him every horrible name she could think of, completely shedding the refined high society persona she had spent years carefully cultivating. It was a vicious, ugly display of raw materialism, and it perfectly captured the entirely transactional nature of their toxic relationship. But the most tragic reaction in the room did not come from the betrayed bride. It came from my mother. Brenda had watched the entire exchange, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking. She saw the absolute financial devastation laid out in the black binder. She heard the confirmation from the governor himself that the Sterling dynasty was a complete mirage. Yet her deeply ingrained toxic conditioning simply refused to accept reality. Her brain could not process a world where the wealthy white family she worshipped was fundamentally inferior to the black daughter she had spent decades tearing down. Instead of consoling her sobbing youngest daughter or demanding answers from the men who had just orchestrated a massive fraud against our family, my mother turned her panicked eyes entirely on me. She rushed forward, closing the physical distance between us, and reached out her trembling hands. "Simone," Brenda pleaded, her voice breathless and frantic. "Simone, you have to fix this. You have to stop this nonsense right now." I looked down at her hands hovering just inches from my arm and simply raised a single eyebrow. She wisely pulled them back, but the sheer desperation in her voice only escalated. She fell right back into her familiar patterns of emotional manipulation, genuinely believing she could still control me. "You cannot do this to your sister," Brenda begged, the tears finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. "This is her wedding day, Simone. The entire city is out there, in that grand ballroom. Governor Mitchell is out there talking to the press. If you foreclose on this family today, if you humiliate them publicly, our reputation will be completely destroyed. People will laugh at us. They will say Jada married a bankrupt fraud, and we will never be invited to another society event again." She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, trying to frame her insane request as a logical family decision. "You have all this money now, Simone." My mother continued, her eyes wide with frantic calculation. "You run this massive company, and you are clearly very successful. You can just forgive the debt. You can write it off as a business loss and let them keep the estate. Preston can get a job at your company to pay you back slowly. For family Simone. I raised you to be the bigger person. You have to save our family reputation." I stood there entirely motionless, staring at the woman who had birthed me. I listened to her actively beg me to absorb millions of dollars in toxic debt to sacrifice my own company and my own hard-earned capital just to maintain a fake aesthetic for a family that fundamentally hated me. She was asking me to set my own empire on fire so Jada and Preston could stay warm in a mansion they did not legally own. Mom. I said, my voice so quiet and terrifyingly calm that it immediately silenced her frantic rambling. You do not have a reputation to save. You never did. You spent 35 years worshipping these arrogant people, begging for a seat at their table while you treated me like absolute dirt. You let that man hand me his coat and treat me like the hired help. You laughed when he told me to work in his mailroom in front of 300 guests. You sold my dignity out for a country club membership that my corporate account actually paid for. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. I am not forgiving a single cent, I told her, the absolute finality of my words hanging heavy in the stagnant air. I am going to collect every last dollar they owe my firm, and I am going to enjoy watching you finally realize that the daughter you threw away is the only reason you are not currently eating out of a dumpster. You chose your family mom. You chose the Sterlings over me. And now you get to burn with them. My mother physically recoiled, as if I had struck her across the face. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, a fresh wave of horrified tears streaming down her cheeks. She finally understood that the generational curse was officially broken. The emotional leverage she thought she held over me was completely gone. I was entirely free. But the heavy silence in the room was abruptly shattered by the sound of Richard Sterling violently pushing himself off the velvet sofa. A man whose entire identity is forged in arrogance and unearned privilege is incredibly dangerous when cornered. The initial shock of my corporate takeover had worn off, replaced by a blinding, desperate rage. He could not fathom losing. He could not comprehend a reality where a black woman walked out of this room as the undisputed victor. He straightened his tailored tuxedo jacket, his chest heaving, his face twisted into a snarl of pure venom. You think you have won? Richard sneered, taking a heavy, threatening step toward me, his pale blue eyes flashing with renewed toxic malice. You think because you bought some paper and ambushed me at a wedding you are suddenly invincible? You are nothing but a little girl playing in a man's world. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my face, trying to summon the terrifying authority that had ruled his life for 60 years. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. Richard spat, his voice rising into a frantic, echoing roar. I built the skyline of this city. I know every politician, every corporate banker, and every federal regulator in this district. I have the best defense lawyers in the entire state on retainer. I have judges on my payroll who have eaten dinner at my private table. You think a few financial spreadsheets and a digital signature are going to take me down? He took another step, his face turning dangerously red, the veins bulging in his neck. I will tie you up in endless litigation for the next 20 years, Richard threatened, spittle flying from his lips. I will bleed your little firm dry with injunctions and appeals. I will drag your name through the mud until you are begging me to take my properties back. The system was built by men like me to protect men like me. I will destroy you, Simone. I will absolutely destroy you. His words were meant to be a devastating show of force. They were the classic empty threats of a powerful man realizing his power was completely gone. He was screaming into the void, desperately trying to summon the monsters he used to control. He was banking on the arrogant assumption that I would be intimidated by the threat of legal battles and corrupt judges. He still believed he had the upper hand, because he was Richard Sterling, the legacy billionaire, and I was just Simone, the outsider. He stood there panting heavily, staring me down, waiting for me to show a single crack of fear. He waited for me to back down, to reconsider my position, to realize I had stepped entirely out of my league. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just stood there looking at a desperate, broken old man, making promises he could not possibly afford to keep. The heavy silence in the bridal suite was suddenly broken by a sound that Richard Sterling was entirely unprepared to hear. I did not cower. I did not stammer out a defense. I did not try to match his frantic, screaming volume. Instead, I threw my head back and laughed. It was a rich, booming laugh that originated deep within my chest and filled every single corner of the dimly lit room. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated amusement. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated by mediocre men and was finally watching one of them actively self-destruct. Richard stopped panting. His mouth hung slightly open, his pale blue eyes wide with profound confusion. He had just threatened to destroy me using the full weight of the local judicial system, and I was laughing in his face as if he had just told a mildly entertaining joke. His entire strategy relied on intimidation, and my laughter completely neutralized his final weapon. I slowly stopped laughing, wiping a single tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. I reached into my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out the slim silver tablet I had used earlier that morning. I tapped the screen, bypassing the encrypted security protocols, and opened my primary corporate email inbox. I found the specific thread I was looking for, an update sent by my lead acquisitions attorney just 3 hours prior. I flipped the tablet around and held it up so the glowing screen was directly in Richard's line of sight. "You should really check your emails before you make legal threats, Richard," I said, my voice dripping with cold condescension. "Those high-powered defense lawyers you just bragged about, the ones you claimed were going to tie me up in litigation for 20 years, they officially dropped you as a client this afternoon. Your massive retainer check bounced at exactly 2 o'clock today. They sent a formal notice of withdrawal to your office. You do not have a legal team, Richard. You do not even have a junior paralegal." Richard squinted at the screen, his eyes frantically scanning the stark black text of the email from the most prestigious law firm in the city. The words were undeniable. They were terminating their representation immediately due to insufficient funds and a complete failure to meet financial obligations. "And as for those judges you proudly claim to have on your payroll," I continued, lowering the tablet and stepping even closer to him. "The ones who ate dinner at your private table. Do you honestly think corrupt men are loyal to a bankrupt developer? They are loyal to capital, Richard. The moment my firm presented them with irrefutable federal evidence of your 3-year Ponzi scheme, they threw you to the wolves to protect their own careers. Those exact same judges are the ones who signed the emergency asset seizure orders this morning. They froze your accounts. They authorized the transfer of your deeds. They did not protect you. They handed you directly to me on a silver platter." The remaining fight completely drained out of Richard Sterling. The aggressive crimson flush faded from his face, leaving him looking incredibly old and impossibly frail. The towering patriarch of the Sterling dynasty was gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man who finally understood that he had absolutely zero leverage left in the world. He had tried to play a game of chess without realizing I had already removed all of his pieces from the board. He staggered backward, his knees buckling beneath him. He hit the edge of the velvet sofa and practically collapsed onto the cushions, burying his face in his shaking hands. A low, guttural sob escaped his throat. It was the sound of a man mourning the death of his own ego. He was completely defeated, stripped of his wealth, his power, and his dignity, in front of the very people he had tried to impress. With Richard entirely neutralized, I locked the screen of my tablet and slowly turned my attention to the other side of the room. It was time to address the true source of my lifelong pain. It was time to face my mother and my sister. Brenda and Jada were standing frozen near the heavy oak doors. They looked like two survivors of a massive shipwreck, clinging to the wreckage of their shattered social ambitions. Jada was still breathing heavily, her makeup completely ruined by her tears, her custom beaded gown looking more like a tragic costume than a symbol of high society triumph. My mother looked entirely hollowed out. The wealthy dynasty she had worshipped had collapsed, and the daughter she had despised had engineered the entire demolition. For 35 years I said, my voice echoing in the quiet suite, drawing their terrified eyes directly to me, "You treated me like dirt. You made me the punchline to your jokes. You constantly violated my boundaries, demanded my money, and minimized my accomplishments simply because I refused to worship your fake aesthetics." I took a slow, deliberate step toward them. You built your entire identities around the desperate need to be accepted by people who secretly despised you. I continued my tone devoid of any anger, leaving only cold, absolute truth. You pushed me away because I was a mirror, reflecting the reality you refused to see. You wanted high society, Jada. You wanted the old money last name. You wanted the country club lifestyle. Well, look around you. I gestured toward Preston, who was still weeping silently beside his father on the sofa. This is your high society marriage, Jada, I stated brutally. You just tied yourself legally and publicly to a man whose family is facing imminent federal indictment for massive financial fraud. You got exactly what you prioritized. You traded your soul for an empty bank account and a fraudulent surname. Enjoy your new life. Jada let out a sharp, agonizing wail, covering her face with her hands. She knew I was right. There was no escape for her. The annulment process would be a nightmare, and the public humiliation would follow her for the rest of her life. She had meticulously planned a society wedding only to orchestrate her own spectacular social suicide. But I was not entirely finished with her. I tapped the screen of my silver tablet, reopening the documents folder. I pulled up the short-form contract she had frantically signed just a few hours earlier. I held the tablet up, tapping my manicured fingernail against her digital signature at the bottom of the screen. The sound of my nail hitting the glass was sharp and precise. By the way, Jada, I said, a slight, terribly cold smile touching the corners of my mouth, that $45,000 you owe me for the food your guests are currently eating outside, the food you begged me to pay for to save your precious reputation, that was not a wedding gift. That was a legally binding promissory note. Jada looked up, her tear-streaked face twisting in fresh horror. She had completely forgotten about the contract in the chaos of the Vanguard revelation. Since Preston is functionally bankrupt and cannot reimburse me on Monday morning, the terms of the agreement remain in full effect, I explained, maintaining my flawless professional composure. The 8% interest kicks in exactly at midnight tonight. I expect my first installment payment on Monday. If you default, I will take you to court, garnish whatever wages you manage to earn, and seize your personal assets. You wanted to treat me like a bank, Jada, so I am treating you like a heavily leveraged liability. My mother, Brenda, finally broke. She fell to her knees on the thick carpet, her expensive silk gown pooling around her. She reached out toward me, her hands grasping at the empty air, sobbing hysterically. She begged me to stop, begging me to show mercy, pleading that we were family. But her tears meant absolutely nothing to me. They were not tears of genuine remorse. They were tears of absolute terror, because she realized she was now entirely at my mercy, and she knew she deserved absolutely none of it. I looked down at her, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of nothingness. The anger, the resentment, the desperate childhood need for her approval, it was all completely gone. The emotional chains she had wrapped around my neck for 3 decades simply dissolved into dust. I turned my back on my mother and my sister, leaving them to drown in the shallow, miserable pool they had dug for themselves. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from the velvet sofa, where Richard Sterling was still hunched over, his face buried in his hands. "Richard," I said, my voice sharp and commanding, forcing him to look up at me. His eyes were bloodshot, his face streaked with tears, his arrogant silver hair a complete mess. I pointed a single finger toward the heavy oak doors. "You are going to need your coat, Richard," I told him flawlessly, mirroring the exact condescending tone he had used on me 24 hours ago at the rehearsal dinner. "Because my private security team is waiting in the lobby right now to physically escort you and your son off my property." Richard blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend the instruction. "Your property," he whispered, his voice breaking. I smiled, the victory, sweet and absolute. "Oh, did I forget to mention that during my corporate presentation? Vanguard Acquisitions bought the Oakbridge Country Club last month. You are currently trespassing in my building, drinking my champagne and ruining my carpet. Get out." I did not wait to watch them scramble to their feet. I did not wait to hear any more of their pathetic apologies or their desperate, empty threats. I turned around and walked purposefully toward the exit. The heavy oak door swung open easily under my hand. I stepped out of the private bridal suite and into the quiet carpeted hallway, closing the door firmly behind me. The heavy wood sealed perfectly, instantly cutting off the sounds of Richard hyperventilating, Preston pleading, and Jada crying. The sudden, absolute silence of the hallway felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I walked smoothly down the corridor, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I bypassed the grand ballroom, where the guests were still buzzing with the gossip of the century. I did not need to see them, the public spectacle was over. I walked straight through the opulent lobby, past the bowing staff, and out the massive glass front doors of the country club. The cool night air hit my face, crisp and incredibly refreshing. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly over the manicured lawns. A sleek black Maybach was idling quietly at the bottom of the grand stone steps, my private chauffeur standing at attention beside the open rear door. I walked down the steps, the emerald crepe of my dress moving gracefully in the evening breeze. I stepped into the spacious leather interior of the luxury vehicle, sinking into the plush seat. The chauffeur closed the door, sealing me inside my private sanctuary. On the center console, a crystal ice bucket held a perfectly chilled bottle of real vintage champagne alongside a single crystal flute. I reached out, popping the cork with a soft, satisfying sigh, and poured the golden, bubbling liquid into the glass. I leaned back against the soft leather, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne tasted like absolute freedom. The generational curse was officially broken. The cycle of abuse was completely dead. I had walked into the fire of my family's toxic expectations and burned their entire false kingdom to the ground. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of my own extraordinary life. I had won. The greatest lesson I learned from that night is that you never have to raise your voice to prove your worth. Toxic family members will always try to shrink you to fit into their broken narratives. They will weaponize guilt and demand your resources while disrespecting your presence. But true power moves in absolute silence. You do not need to seek validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Build your own empire, protect your peace, and let your success speak for itself. When you finally stop playing their game, you realize you owned the board all along. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace, let me know your story in the comments below, and hit subscribe for more journeys of healing and empowerment.